When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hi and welcome to the Skeptic Studio, the Brainstorm production that focuses on interviews. In this episode, I talked to Josh Richards, host of the JRR Talking podcast, and we touched on a variety of things from his deconversion to his dealing with addiction to what he thinks about mythicism. It was a good chat, and I hope that you enjoy it. If you do, then make sure to share it on Facebook, tweet it out, spread the word in some other way. If you want to support the show, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. And make sure to subscribe to the show on your podcast app of choice. And so, without any further bullshit from me, here's my interview with Josh Richards. First, I guess, welcome to the Brainstorm Skeptic Studio. My initial contact with you was because my friend Rick or Uber47 from the Secular Barbershop podcast contacted me about a member of our community who had passed away, and he mentioned that you were a close friend of his.
Yes, Bruce Horst.
Right, yeah. Who had a post that went viral a while back?
Yeah, he had a post that went viral about how the issue of Obamacare was what led him to lose his faith, and how that was kind of like the last nail in that coffin.
Right. How did you meet this community? How did you lose your faith?
Okay, well, that's kind of there's kind of 2 points there. As far as the community, I met Bruce through actually a humanist group that meets on Sundays, Sunday mornings. Definitely not a church, but we congregate. We have talks of various speakers who come through, and that's actually how I met Bruce. I know that Rick and Bruce and you know each other from a different community, but I actually knew Bruce in person. Me and Rick have hung out before several times. We actually went to Bruce's memorial together. But as far as losing my faith, that was a really gradual process that started, I would say, maybe in the late 2000s, but honestly, it really came to a fever pitch in 2013.
Okay.
For 7 years of my life, I worked as a Christian pastor. I was a youth pastor, an associate pastor, and a programs director for various churches in the Methodist tradition. I was raised hardcore Baptist, like Calvinist Baptist, and in my teenage years, I became interested in philosophy. I wouldn't say I was radically interested because I didn't care about science that much, and I think that's the bedrock of philosophy if you really get into it. But I was interested in how the interchange of ideas could refine, and how it could be personally edifying, and how it could be encouraging. And I also had this really interesting epiphany that the law of non-contradiction allows one to essentially show other people up when they contradict themselves. It kind of allows you to make logical points that can't be refuted. And so that pushed me out of my problems with Calvinism. I began to see that if you can show somebody's arguments are inconsistent, you can better defend your position. And so from the ages of 17 until 25, I began working in churches. I got started very young. And I pretty quickly liberalized around 19 to Methodism because I realized the Bible's not literally true, and there are plenty of things in it that are historically inaccurate, inconsistent, and just flat out wrong. And so you kind of do this little Dutch boy routine when you start putting your fingers in the holes, and for a while I could do that. But in 2013, there were three big things probably a lot more. But the three biggest things were, I was incredibly dissatisfied. I thought that, chasing the ministry was something that would make me happy. All the ministers I knew put on this amazing face, and I never was as fulfilled as I was promised to be. I had spent all this time being scared about hell, thinking that this would be this, great adventure, and it never lived up to the hype. And the other two things were, I took a great interest in theology. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a Greek scholar, but if I sit down with my lexicon and my Greek Bible, I can start putting together a pretty decent translation, and there are a lot of vague things in the text. However, perhaps the most jarring for me was this hell issue. I began to study as much as I could, and I'll spare you a long Bible lesson, but the kicker is that what Jesus was talking about when he talks about hell in the New Testament, and what the Catholic Church teaches about hell when they teach people, or what Baptists teach children about hell being this eternal place of damnation and suffering and torment, it's not exactly what Jesus is talking about. And I was so relieved to find out that Jesus was being metaphorical. He was talking about a place, and we can maybe talk about this more in a little bit, about how the word for hell is a actual physical location that Jews would be familiar with. Jesus knew his audience, and so learning this inspired me. I was so happy that I had finally managed to, I thought theologically and philosophically overthrow what I think to be, if you'll pardon my pun, the most damnable of doctrines. And the last thing was I had began to study not only philosophy but science for the first time, like seriously getting into science. I had spent so much time obsessed with apologetics in my own little Christian world that I refused to ever consider the other side. I only read enough about science to refute it, namely like atheist claims regarding science, the problem of evil, and problems with evolution. And so I thought it would be a great test of my faith. But I'd also become interested in evolution, and I took a course called Evolutionary Biology, and it was taught for non-science majors. And a philosophy teacher who has 2 doctorates named Dr. Keith M. Parsons, somebody who's a friend of mine, an amazing man. I had taken philosophy courses with him before, and I took this class. And about halfway through, I began coming an hour early and staying however late he would stay, and I would press him, and I wouldn't challenge him to be like pompous. I really wanted to know. I thought he was going to not be able to meet the standards I held for for proving that it was true. And halfway through the course, I read a ton of books. I read all of Darwin's Origin, The Descent of Man, a couple of books by Christians, a couple of books by atheists. And while I wasn't quite at atheism, I had this epiphany that Darwin was right. And for the first time in my life, at the age of 25, I had realized that I had been mistaken about creationism, that at the very least, even if God did exist, he did it through billions and billions of years. And I had this Gestalt shift. And so I had begun liberalizing, getting rid of hell, and I, in my ministry job, had begun talking about this pretty openly. I found it inspiring, if I'm being honest. I found it freeing, exciting. I love talking about it. And at a certain point, there was a job I had. I'm not going to pretend like I was the best minister ever, but I cared. I very much cared. I was very sincere in my belief, and I had a lot of great people who I had working relationships with. Unfortunately, that doesn't always do the job, and so on top of, I guess, my superior who there was no, I guess the Christian word is discipleship, but we never connected. We never were close. This was a recurring theme to me having ministers who they knew I liked to read and ask questions, and they just stayed away from me.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. And so, and I'm going to give you a long answer here, but the culmination was shortly after talking about these things, I was brought in for a surprise review, and I was fired.
Okay.
I was literally laughed out of a church building, and shortly thereafter, because it's not always reason that helps us change our minds, especially when we make big decisions, but I think it was also a little bit of having my heart broken, that I I couldn't go back. I began to realize after a couple of weeks, and my feelings began to, my spirits would rise a little bit more after that. I noticed that I didn't believe anymore.
Right.
And it was something I didn't want to go to church anymore. I didn't want to play. I didn't want to do this balancing act. I finally felt comfortable. And shortly thereafter, it got a lot harder because I realized I had to tell people in my life, hey, this is where I'm at.
Sounds like quite a journey. Do you feel like it's benefited your life, this conclusion that you've come to?
Oh, yes. I spend a lot of time talking with people who are working through it, who are going through the deconversion process, if you want to call it that. I don't deconvert people. I'm pretty adamant when it comes to people who are deconverters I argue against that. I think you should and maybe it's semantics, but I think if somebody wants to change their mind, be there for them, help them, love them no matter what. But there is a lot that I try to be careful because it's a very painful process for some. For me, it was. But in the end, I felt like the goods achieved were absolutely worth that. If you're going to live trying to be as reasonable as you can, and if you're going to try and value rationality and really value it, sometimes that means we have to give up comforting illusions. And that's not easy at first. However, what we find is that if we think skeptically and if we think rigorously, the things that manage to withstand that scrutiny, those things are really worth having. Those things are really beautiful, and I think it's absolutely worth it. But it's also really, really hard. There are people who reach out to me, and I love doing this. I'm not a counselor. I have degrees, but I never finished my degree in psychology. I just didn't. And so I'm not a doctor and I'm not a professional, but people feel comfortable talking to me. They kind of know that, because honestly, and I'm not ashamed talking about this anymore. I had such a rough time that I had a lot of friends. I had family. I had a girlfriend at the time. And things were really serious, and I lost a lot of relationships. And on top of a difficult situation, on top of that, I acted very foolishly. I began drinking. I developed a serious drug problem. I had already been prescribed painkillers that I used moderately, if ever. And at a certain point, as I became really depressed and down, I got seriously hooked on opiates. And it took years to get off that. It's been 2 years, 8 months, and a couple days since the last time I ever used. Wow. But I thoroughly messed my life up. I had issues with the local constabulary. That means I went to jail. That's fancy speak for I went to jail. Right. I've been to rehabs. I had my ass dumped at freehabs. And AA and NA are not programs that I find very helpful. I struggled. I was not allowed to tell people that I was an ex-minister. I was pushed hard to believe in, you need to believe in God. I lived in a halfway house for drug addicts, and this wasn't the law making me do it either. I had nowhere else to go. And since then, I've really struggled with poverty. I've really struggled with a lot of problems trying to put my life together, because what do you do when you're a minister and your degrees are either in humanities, philosophy, religion, and your experience is all being a pastor? There's not a whole lot that you can do with your life after that. So to give you the super long answer, I still think it's worth it. And I hope that part of what I can do with my life is to maybe help people, because you can't make somebody not do stupid shit. But I wish there would have been some more resources for people like me. I know there's the Clergy Project. Interestingly enough, none of that worked out between me and them. I don't have any ill will for those people, but I think they could kind of tell that I was somebody who I was on a really, really awful path, and there was really nothing. And so I do hope that that as I keep doing this, I try and stay open, and I try and reach out to as many people as will want to reach out to me who are going through that process, because it's hard.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So what do you think actually helped you on your road to recovery? Because it was after you lost your faith, right?
Yes.
So I wondered, what was it that ultimately did kind of push you in the right direction?
Well, it's interesting how as time goes on, the narrative changes. You become a little wiser. You see things. I would say that a big thing was I was sick of being miserable. To be addicted to a drug is, especially opiates, is you're sick all of the time. You're miserable all of the time. You're acting in ways you're not proud of. I didn't sell my body or anything, but you just become a person who you don't want to be, and you're very aware of that, but you can't do anything to stop it. I really resent a lot of programs. However, there are, despite having, AA and NA being full of people who want to push the God thing on you, there are a lot of folks in those groups and rooms who are willing to look past that and reach out to you. And while I had a great difficulty, I was able to stick around long enough to get off all of that. And I found as time went on that I was able to kind of face my own issues and deal and cope without getting completely blasted. And somewhere in that process, I just began to slowly rebuild. You meet a lot of terrible people in those places, in jail too. It's not like you're going to make friends in these places meant for people who are having the worst experience of their life. But in time, I had friendships. I had one particular friendship that kind of started, who I've known for a long time before all of this. And there was a couple of friends here and there who had stuck with me, and people who had stayed in my life. And after a long while, I was able to kind of build friendships, and along the way, I met my fiance, who I'm currently engaged to. And I would really say that somewhere in developing healthy relationships, so I would say that was a huge factor.
Right.
There are these awesome studies about mice who, given the option, if you get them addicted to cocaine, but you set it up so that way when they do cocaine they have to be alone, or they can be social around other mice, they typically prefer to be around other mice. We're very social creatures, and once you get over that initial addiction, you stand a real fighting chance if you have people in your life who care about you and who you care about. So I think,
right.
And also I can't discount the secular community I'm a part of down here. There's a group called Oasis. There are other groups. I go to Oasis. That's where Bruce Hurst would go, and that's how I met him. But I would say Oasis is really important. But also, I probably those significant relationships. That's a huge part.
So what is Oasis?
It's a free thought organization. It's not a church. I don't represent it. I'm just a guy who goes. I'm a hardcore fan. I
Right.
love it. I hope one day to start one of my own or something like it. And there, it essentially, I joke and call it Atheist Church, but I usually get scolded. I don't get scolded, but essentially it's a group of people. There are 5 core values. The first of which is people are more important than beliefs. There are 4 more. I can list them out if you want, but the basic idea is that it's a community. You don't have to believe anything or disbelieve anything. It's a place where, all are accepted. All are tolerated, all are loved, and on Sundays we have a tradition. I don't want to say traditional, but it's very similar to community groups, or maybe it's somewhat similar to maybe the Unitarians, but it's very different in that you get there and there is no star of the show. There's no head pastor. There are people who have started it. But at the beginning, there's music. We have various musicians who come through. Most of them are good. And there's a short talk that's 10 minutes. It can be a personal thought. I usually talk, if I ever do these, I talk about philosophy, interesting thoughts. I have one that's actually doing okay on YouTube right now called Jesus Would Have Made a Good Atheist. And,
Nice.
And then there's a short break. And people chat. And then there's a main talk, which is essentially a 20-minute TED Talk. The short talk is 10 minutes. The long talk is 20. And usually those are very good. There are people who do research. There are people who are authors. There are sometimes we've had big names come through and they do a presentation. It is essentially an opportunity to put out your own research. It is there. Very rarely does religion come up. We have people who are interested in religion. I gave a talk on hell. I've talked before about issues in religion and philosophy of religion, but a lot, last week's we talked about the history of jazz, and the week before that we did have a religious talk. It was these two atheists who go to Sunday school classes and just engage people. They've been doing this for a long time, just getting to know people and not challenging them, but getting in there and just saying, hey, we don't believe, we want to talk to you. And they presented their findings doing that. And it was fascinating. And so really what it's done is, and so afterwards there's lunch, but, people are free to, if you want to do a talk, you just talk to the right person and say, hey, I'm interested. You send an email. You can get involved really easily. And unlike the church, there you can, it's completely different. And that's why I guess they stress
right.
that, because you're not going to have midweek meetings where you can drink freely. Or, you can be open saying, hey, I don't believe this, or say, I struggle with this, or here's where I'm at. Like, we encourage thought and conversation. When we go out to lunch, me and a couple other friends, usually we'll go sit off wherever restaurant we're at, and we will just talk shit out. Usually it gets pretty vulgar and hilarious because that's how I speak. But, it's a really good way to connect to people. I think that, at least in Houston where I'm at, where people are friendly, but it's hard to make friends, especially when you're like me. I'm 30. I talk to strangers. I'll talk to dogs, but it can be hard to find friends and to find people who you can identify with, because humanity, for as good as we are, we're also pretty self-centered. I certainly am, and it's hard
right.
to. It's really hard to be like, I find people to connect with. Like, I'm super social. My fiance is a good bit more introverted than me. And so when you're our age, I mean, it's hard we're not in high school. You're not just going to go find friends, or, sometimes you work with people who are assholes.
Yeah.
And you don't want to hang out
right.
with them.
You can't just be friends with them. Yeah. No, for sure. I have that, my job is pretty good. Like, the guys I work with are really good guys, but they're good guys to work with. Like, we don't share any of the same political views or social views in any way, really. So they're good guys to work with.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So you also have a podcast, right?
Yes, I do. It's called JRR Talking. You can find it at jrrtalking.com. And there's a YouTube channel, I think, and there's a Twitter I almost never use.
Twitter's a bit of a rough terrain sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think I'm cool enough for Twitter. I tried to log in and they said, we're sorry, you're just not made for this.
Yeah. You gotta be pretty harsh. Like, everything on there has like that edge to it. Like, you're really trying to be cutting edge or make a major point, or in some cases hurt somebody's feelings. It's a hard place to be. Yeah.
And I can imagine that you as a Canadian, understand that, it's not always easy being mean to people. Actually, I've never been to Saskatchewan, but, in my time in Canada and Calgary, I loved it. And I loved how people are so much friendlier there than they are here in Texas. And, but if I'm being honest, I try not to be a mean guy. Like, I guess if you were to ask the right person, they might call me an asshole, but I don't get off on hurting anyone's feelings. I am not that kind of atheist. I take issue with people like right. Richard Dawkins and some of these horsemen guys. Like, I love Hitchens. His writing was amazing. Daniel Dennett, I actually was a part of his, one of his studies into clergy who don't believe. I wasn't a non-believer, but I was liberal enough that they still wanted to have me interviewed. And he was fantastic. However, Hitchens in his worst moods, Harris in his worst moods, and almost everything Dawkins does is so offensive and mean. I don't see the point in calling Christians stupid. I don't think they are stupid. I think they believe, in a metaphysical, I think their metaphysics are wrong. But right. I think that for almost every other field of study, these are perfectly reasonable people, who just turn a blind eye to the problems and inconsistencies in the Bible. I'm putting up a podcast I had with a friend of mine who's a youth pastor now, and I think he's a great guy. I think what he's doing for the youth that he serves is awesome. He's serving a need that they have, and they would be worse off to not have him in that capacity. But I think he's wrong. And I think when I press him, he says, yeah, sure, there are inconsistencies in the Bible, but the general message is important. And I'm all about the general message of radical acceptance, of loving your neighbor. In fact, I like to joke sometimes that, I Christed my way all the way to atheism. I really want to love my neighbor. I do believe I am my brother's keeper sometimes. I want to be like that. I want to be connected to people. I want to feel love. I want to be loved, and I want to love. And I'd love to see the world be a place that's really beneficial to live in. I'd love to see that. I want to see community.
Sounds like we want the same thing. You mentioned earlier that sometimes people don't come to atheism through reason or even skepticism through reason. And I've been considering that more and more. Like, I think people almost never are convinced by reason. It almost always has to have some emotional angle to it that impacts them personally. Oh, yes.
I would probably still be kicking around liberal churches if it weren't for getting fired. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I know that I would have stayed around a lot longer. But you make an excellent point. I think that stress and emotion play a huge role just as much as rationality does in how we live our lives. I think that Aristotle was absolutely right. He writes a book about logic. He was the first person to do systematic logic, we believe. And he writes a book, not one of his most important books is called On Rhetoric. And what he says is, look, we should be just these rational beings, but if you really want to convince people, if you want to see change, you have to show people why you're right. And rhetoric gets a bad rap because now we associate it with like the word bullshit. But for Aristotle, he doesn't mean, go bullshit somebody. What he's talking about is he's saying, show these people, give them examples they can understand, speak to them in a way that is convincing. And while you're at it, go ahead and be logically consistent and tell the truth, because that's the best thing to do. However, we aren't always rational. Like there's this myth that we're going to, like Immanuel Kant talks about pure reason. We are almost never purely reasonable. Nobody is like Mr. Spock, we feel too much. We are entirely too quick to, we respond with fear or love almost all of the time. Those are like the two base instincts in humanity, and you have to appeal to those.
Yeah, absolutely. Without that, reason can't take a foothold. I guess I'm not an expert by any stretch, but it just seems so clear that without the emotional appeal, you can't. Yeah, like you said it better than I did.
Well, thank you. This is a point that I'm constantly making again and again. But and you don't have to be, like you said, you don't have to be super smart to get this. I just think it's human nature. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise man. We could just as easily call ourselves Homo religioso. And I don't just mean that because of like religion, but we seek patterns. Have you ever noticed that we see faces in the clouds and faces in wood grains and faces everywhere? Yeah. We see patterns. And we see things where there aren't things. We are just a little bit crazy. And it's a myth that we're purely rational. Even very rarely do you find somebody who makes decisions. And I think in our best moments, we can say, hey, this is the rational thing to do. But if I think of any major life decision I've made, it's always been something emotional, and that's not always a bad thing. When thinking about my fiance, I recently, I think I've mentioned her 3 times now, so sorry, I'm crazy about her. She's actually sitting downstairs, probably hearing me talk about her up here. But she, when I think about the decision to want to get married, it wasn't just rational. I have excellent rational reasons for wanting to marry her. She's lovely. She treats me very well, and she makes me very happy. But at the same time, there are deeply emotional reasons too. That's the most important thing. I feel a connection to her. I feel that the experience we've had over the past 3 years has been one of the best, one of the most significant relationships I've ever had, and that in itself is kind of its own rational reason. I think that and you'd have to have the two, because if it was just saying, oh, it looks good on paper, that's not quite enough. I mean, she loves these Jane Austen movies, which I've had to sit through, and I would never admit to her that I kind of liked them sometimes. But you need sense and sensibility. I mean, and that's probably a really stupid way to reference that, but the point rings true. We need both.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. So I guess kind of to veer off, what is your show about, your podcast about?
So in my podcast, I bring people on to tell stories and to talk to me. I have various people come on. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, but it's probably the lesser of my projects, but I still love doing it. I like to have people on, and I just want to hear about the world as they see it. Like, I had a youth pastor on and I grilled him a little bit, but honestly, it was good natured. And most of it was him telling me about his decision to want to go into the ministry, why he stays, why he's so passionate about it. I like hearing how other people see the world. I've had atheist authors who are hardcore angry telling me about how much they hate the Bible. I have a gay pastor who works at a gay church in Virginia, talking. Neat. Yeah, Ray Cobb is the first episode. I've had the activist in Houston, Ray Hill, who he has not only fought for gay rights, but he has also fought for your right in America to call a cop a motherfucker. Seriously, Ray Hill versus I think it's the United States. They went to the Supreme Court. He's very proud of that. And I've had other people on, and it's really about having these conversations about life, because I think that's one of the things that I miss most about my time in the church. In fact, if I can, I know nobody listening to this is probably in Houston. I hope they are. But I'm doing a midweek Bible study for Oasis, and it's just for Lent. It's through the book of Mark and John. But the main reason I'm doing it isn't just to hear my own voice or to, show people, oh, Josh knows the Bible and he can read a little bit of Greek. It's really because I love that connection. And I just feel like, if you want to see something in the world, try it, do it. And so part of the podcast is I want to keep talking about these things. I love getting asked to speak. I love doing presentations. If I could do it full time as a job, I would. And so the podcast is kind of building up those skills, but also having people on, because I firmly believe that as we keep going into this postmodern era, I'm not big in postmodernism, but as far as a historical marker, I use that because I just think it fits. And I think that we're going to have to listen to other people, and we're going to have to be able to respect and love other people, no matter whether they're atheists, whether they're more atheist than us, less atheist than us, too Christian, whatever. I think that, tolerance is something I value a whole lot. And part of the project goal is for me to learn how to interact and understand other people, because I remember what it was like to be a Christian. And as I get older, here I am at 30, I am just now only a couple years in thinking, there's a lot of ways to live life. I made it all the way to 23, 24, thinking that, there was something wrong with gay people, something wrong with trans people. And I'm not going to pretend to understand the struggles that people in the LGBTQ alphabet soup community struggle with. But I see in myself now that I'm a lot more accepting and a lot more loving and a lot more willing to try to understand people. And that's something I want to foster, not in myself, not just in myself, but in others. I think in Canada, y'all are way ahead of us in that regard.
Well, it's tough to say for sure, because we are in general kind of in that more progressive side of things, but there's certainly a very strong element of people who want to emulate the right down in your neck of the woods. And they seem to be growing all the time. And it is, our politics does sort of follow your politics to a degree. So hopefully we don't get too much farther to the right.
Oh goodness.
Some of our people, but.
And I'd like to apologize. I don't skew too political, but I'd like to apologize for our present mascot. If you looked at our election, the great majority of us did not want that guy. I'm not a big fan of. I wasn't a fan of his rival, but I am not a fan of our current mascot.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting that there's even still a core group of people who attach themselves to him or like follow him because he's just so awful in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people out there giving way better commentary about this than me, yeah. But it's just something that as a friend of reason, it drives me crazy how somebody can lie and get away with things that nobody else would. And it's just because he was doing all of this shit before he got into office. And so people are like, oh, that's just him. But to me, and there are books being written about this right now. I know one author working on one but for me, the craziest thing is how people like my parents who are Christian people, they totally buy into this idea. He is the candidate he's God's candidate. He's God's choice. The mental gymnastics required to buy that, I'm just not able to. I can't. It's way too much work. Not enough juice for the squeeze.
Yep, for sure. It does seem like I don't know. I really can't wrap my head around the way people fit what he does into any kind of religious context, unless it's the anti-Muslim or like some sort of bigoted context, like the accepting kind of love is God type message that a lot of people have. It just seems so counterintuitive to that.
Oh, yes. Well, a lot of these supporters are hardcore Bible thumpers who they are not into the God is love message. They are into the Old Testament wrath. You know, you're going to get what you deserve. And honestly, that's something that's one of the most troubling things, not only in human nature, but definitely in the country that I live in, because there are two Americas, and it's not just liberal conservative, because there's plenty of conservatives like this too. It's not fair to say conservatives don't care or that they're heartless, because they're not. There are plenty who are remarkably liberal on some issues, but there's just this idea of other people are bad, whether it's the immigrants, the Muslims, or whoever. This idea that, you know, we're going to set it right and we're going to get these bastards, you know, put down. And it scares me because you see these rednecks who come out, you know, with their high powered rifles and talking about how Allah is a whore and Jesus is the most high God and fuck you, fuck you and go home. I can't help but be in awe, because if you've ever read anything the Galilean carpenter named Jesus ever said, even in those Gospels, those red words in the book, that's Jesus talking there. You know, go read that shit. He says, care for the widows, care for those who are sick. The poor will always be with you. The story of the Samaritan woman at the well, that story shocked people because rabbis didn't sit with women. Teachers did not sit with women alone. That would be considered, you know, inappropriate and crass. But even more so, it's a Samaritan woman. They called the Jews at that time called Samaritans half-breeds and dogs. Jesus in this story approaches a woman. She's one of these half-breed women. And then he says to her, you've had 5 husbands and the guy you're fucking now isn't your husband. And he doesn't condemn her. And people just, I mean, anyway, I don't mean to go off on a tangent here, but it's just, you know, when you talk about people in the presidency, if you're going to say because you can't get into any high office without saying you believe in God. I can't think of but a couple people who might be able to skirt through. And even to be a Christian helps a lot too. To be a non-Christian is very difficult. And to still get into office. However, if you're going to say you buy this and your base values aren't love others, give of yourself, be generous, be liberal. And I mean that in the classical sense. And not like, I mean like the way Aristotle uses that, to be understanding, kind and generous and to want others to thrive as well as yourself. If that's not your bedrock when you say that I'm into Jesus, I'm going to write you the fuck off so quick. And I think Jesus was wrong about a lot, but as you can tell, there's a lot of that Christian message I still carry with me. I can't get away from the good stuff it put in my life, and I don't want to.
Right. No, that's fair. The message of be good to other people is one that we should all be holding on to, I think, anyway. You talked about Jesus a little bit, and I saw on your Facebook page that you've been reading a bit of Robert Price and Richard Carrier, perhaps. What do you think of the mythicist perspective?
Every time I go on a podcast in Canada, this comes up. Okay, so I've read David Fitzgerald, I've read Robert Price, and I have also read everything Bart Ehrman has ever wrote. Right. And so there's a couple of things that I can say, but if I'm just saying my opinion, I think Jesus existed. I think the guy was absolutely real. If you ask me on like just in an epistemological sense, I'm going to say I might lean a little more towards agnosticism on that issue than I did previously, because I see that I think I have a blind spot, that I was so into the faith for so long that to me, and this is totally ridiculous, but I'm being honest here, that it almost seems to me like I would feel like I've wasted my time somehow even more if it turns out this is all made up. However, however, that's how I feel. And so that kind of pushes me a little bit more towards agnosticism, seeing that is a huge blind spot. But I agree with Bart Ehrman that, you know, Socrates never wrote anything down. Apollonius of Tyana never wrote anything down. We're left with just little things that their students wrote. Pontius Pilate, we only have a couple of coins and a couple little snippets here and there that demonstrate his existence as a historical figure. So at the very least, I would say I'm probably 70% sure that Jesus was a person or a amalgam of different apocalyptic teachers. I don't think it's the most important thing. Like, you know, William Lane Craig, this Christian apologist, will say, oh, well, Calvinism is a matter of discussion between brethren. If I were a condescending asshole, I might say something similar to that. But I think it's not something I think atheists should argue about unless they're, you know, at the bar having a good time. Because I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters that much. Like after 2 or 3 drinks, it doesn't matter so much. But I think Jesus definitely existed. I think there's good reason to think that. I think that if you don't, that's fine. But yeah, sure. I definitely think the guy was there. I think that there's enough to kind of show he was there. We don't really, obviously, then here's the problem that the mythicists always come back with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Obviously, these stories are legend. These things contradict each other, but they do agree that there was a guy and who was an apocalyptic preacher, and I don't think that can be denied easily.
My thought is that, yeah, like obviously everything about Jesus is a legend, right? So, but I think that the historical expert opinion is that he existed, at least in some capacity. So I think as a lay person, I have to go with that because I don't have the documentation to back up anything else. And really all I've seen from the mythicist perspective is questions without answers in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think they bring up a good point, but I think that, you know, there are some like David Fitzgerald who I think of him as somebody who is trying to be as unbiased as they can. I think that some of the mythicists that I've met, not necessarily going to name authors' names, but I think people personally, I think that they find that embracing that view maybe kind of helps them in their axe grinding, that it helps them, you know what, Jesus wasn't even real. And you're dumb for believing it. And to me, that immediately flies in the face of my being against just being cruel to people and calling them stupid. You're not going to change minds. You're not going to enlighten anybody treating them like a dick.
Yeah, for sure. It's it's counterproductive in a sense. I don't know. The mythicist thing is it's an interesting intellectual discussion quite often, but yeah, I don't know that it has any real importance in the way the message might come across. I don't believe in God. So whether Jesus was real or not, I don't believe in any miracles or any magic. So it seems almost a moot point in many ways.
Yeah.
what have you been doing within the atheist community lately, or what do you think of the atheist community lately?
Well, as far as what I think of, I really only have a good grasp as what's going on here in Texas. There are different groups. I'm very inspired to see that groups like Oasis and Churches of Free Thought are hanging around, and that there are, within the age of meetup.com, that there are groups who are coming together and organizing, because I think that's encouraging, and it's something that a lot of atheists are like, I am not about to go join another group because I don't feel like giving my time and money up. And that's fine. You're welcome to do that. But I think it's really encouraging to see people standing up and coming together under that banner, because in the past 30 years, I think it's become a lot easier to come out as an atheist. It's interesting because in the church, they would have you think we live in a world where everybody's atheist and nobody cares about God, whereas it's
right.
very different. Most people believe in God. We are a minority opinion. And so yeah. I think it's good to see that tide is changing. I don't think religion's going to disappear, but I think it's important that people see that there are atheists who are moral realists, people who believe in right and wrong. I'm sure you hear this all the time. People are like, oh, the two things I get the most are, how did the universe create itself, Mr. Smart Atheist? Or how can you be a moral person if there is no absolute eternal authority to appeal to? What keeps you from raping people and murdering people? And I'm like, what keeps you from raping and murdering people? Are you hiding behind your sanctity because your perversions are that strong? Let me know, because if you give up the ghost, we should call the cops and say, hey, if this guy stops going to church for a couple of weeks, he's probably out there just fucking shit up. And so it's good to see that. As far as what I'm doing, I present as much as I can. I do talks. I love to speak at whatever group will host me or have me. I usually don't get paid. Occasionally I have before, which is incredibly encouraging because I'm poor and I need it. But I like to either, half of the talks I do are about ideas, philosophy, because I'm a huge nerd in that, and I think that it's important. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about the Life of the Mind. But the rest is also encouragement. I've been, like I said earlier, I've had a really tough time, legal problems, drug problems, and I think that my secular friends, and one of my believing friends, but I think I owe a lot to the secular community and what it's brought to my life. And so I want to do whatever I can. It will change. The other thing I do is I find more than that. I have a podcast. Yeah, I speak. I don't think I'm going to be getting famous soon. I hope I do. Not really. I don't think it'd be great to be famous, but even people in philosophy, even if you're famous, you're not really famous.
Yeah, that's not a real fame and fortune type famous, right?
Yeah, it'd be nice to pay my bills though. That's kind of my dream, yeah. And I am actively working towards that. We'll see how that goes. But I'd say the other thing, like I said earlier, is just being open with other people, without having to try, without having to write or speak. Just if I do that because I enjoy doing it and I have trouble shutting up. But on the other hand, there are people who I am so. I'm trying to think of what's the atheist word for blessed. I'm so fortunate that there are people who, and this doesn't happen all the time. I'm not going to pretend like I'm not famous, but there are people who will occasionally, through my site, through my Facebook, people who show up at Oasis, they'll seek me out and reach out to me and say, hey, I just discovered, or I don't believe anymore, or I stopped believing months ago and no one in my family knows, my wife doesn't know, or people who come to me, and there are people who maybe they don't have exactly my story, but there are people who struggle. There are people who I've known, and without putting people on blast, I had one friend, his son was gay, and that was kind of the last straw for him. He's like, I don't buy this anymore, and I'm not about to put up with a bunch of homophobes giving me shit because my son likes dudes. And
right.
And there's other people who, one friend, he had a family member, a young child, die of bone cancer. And then another person had, an abusive relationship that eventually played a part in someone deciding to kill themselves. And these people, whatever it is, because that's your emotional side, right? Finally saying to your rational side, hey, you need to get out. And like I said, I'm not Dr. Phil or anything, but there are people who just say, hey, I need someone to talk to. And I can kind of share my experience and say, it's tough. It's because even it doesn't matter whether God exists or not. It's tough out there. Life isn't always easy and perfect and beautiful. I fucking wish it were, but it's not. And we need encouragement. And I find that my opinion is that I'm pretty cynical on like, the first several levels of my personality. I am a selfish person. People are selfish, but I think that in spite of that, we can cooperate and do great things. We also, not only are we selfish, but sometimes we are so selfish we will cooperate so that way our happiness is better. And so in exactly that way, I find that by putting myself out there, occasionally there are people who they bring a lot to my life, and they give me a chance to keep working through my problems and my issues by listening to them and by being there for them. I love to see that there are people who maybe I wouldn't be friends with because we have our paths wouldn't cross any other way, who I know who are from just me being out there saying, hey, I don't believe in God. And if you don't, that's okay. And if you're too quiet to get out there and put that out there, I'll be that guy. There are a lot of us out there who are just these loudmouths, and I'll gladly wear that mantle because in a lot of ways I'm still a preacher. That's really it. I was born for that, and while I don't believe, that puts me in a weird spot, but I'm still very much a preacher. I think that life is good. There are things that go wrong in my life all the time, and it's not always pleasant. In fact, there's shit I go through that makes me sick some mornings. But overall, it's so much better to be with people and to be authentic. I think that's the whole big tying it all together. Authenticity. I want to, and if you believe in God, that's fine. But if you're like me, be authentic. Be who you are. And if you don't believe in God, say that shit, because we're going to die one day and that's it. So, enjoy your cake now, motherfucker. You're going to die one day.
Yeah, that's right. No, that sounds great. It's been great talking to you. Where can people find your stuff?
You can find, I have a YouTube channel I'm adding videos to, called JRR Talking. You can find talks and podcasts and thoughts I have on my website, jrrtalking.com. You can find me on Facebook at Joshua Richards. I'm in Houston, Texas. Go ahead and add me, and we can stay connected. Or you can find anything else through my site. Check it out if you feel like it. Add me or like or follow my JRR Talking page on Facebook. And if you ever need someone to talk to, shoot me an email. And I love getting to meet people. I love getting to chat, and I love having what I think. I've always thought this is a really important conversation, when I believed and when I didn't. For sure. I really appreciate your time. Yeah, thank you for having me on. Maybe you can come on my show sometime. We can let you talk for a chance. That would be great. Although my story is not nearly as interesting as yours, but that's all right. So that was my interview with Josh Richards from the JRR Talking podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a good chat, and he genuinely seems like a great guy. It looks like his show hasn't had an episode for a little while, but I'm sure the next time he puts one out, it will be great. You can check out his stuff at jrrtalking.com. Let me know if you listened to this episode and tell me what you thought. From the analytics that I'm looking at, it seems like people are more interested in hearing the full crew than the extra episodes that I put out on my own. So let me know if that's accurate, and I can do less of these individual episodes. For everything else, you can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com or brainstormblog.net. I'm slowly catching up on show notes. They'll be a little less snazzy than they have been in the past, but they'll be done. I want to thank our financial supporters, Zach, Stephanie, Utah Outcasts, Bassett, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Destin Sucks, Lachlan, Destin Doesn't Suck That Much, Magnus, Michael, Positively Skeptical, Rob, and that's it. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast.
I want to thank Josh again for joining me, and I apologize for the lateness of this getting out. If you can find his stuff at jrrtalking.com, like I said before, and I'll put that link in the show notes. You can also support us by donating to our GoFundMe for the conference at gofundme.com/shift-2-reason-conference-2018. Or you can go buy some stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. It's a lot of dashes and slashes, but the links are in the show notes. Thanks to Dave for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi from the Embrace the Void podcast for doing the new voiceover. You can find his stuff at voidpod.com. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ads, and thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. You can find his stuff at aloststateofmind.com. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
This is an opinion-based podcast. Each person on the podcast is responsible for their own opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily reflect the views of the rest of the panel. Any guests or anyone associated with the people on the podcast, such as spouses, partners, children, other family members, friends, or employers. No one person speaks for the podcast with the possible exception of Cory, and he doesn't speak for anyone else on the show. The Brainstorm podcast does not represent the views of our sponsors.
We just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listens to us, shares the show, gives us a rating on iTunes or Stitcher, or supports us through Patreon and Gumroad. We don't have a lot of interactions with our listeners, but what we have had proves that we attract some of the best people around. Smart, kind, and cool. An audience truly worthy of the titles hardcore and woo-free. Thanks for helping us make the world a smarter place.